Carrie, thank you so much for making the time for us. We are thrilled to have you as a guest on our campus. Please welcome Kerry Washington. And our own university professor, Anita Hill.
She's worth standing for. I want to apologize. I was trying to gracefully hide my tissues. I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive me for snorting and making all kinds of unladylike sounds up here.
Oh, we love them. So we're going to have a brief conversation and then take some questions. And as Carrie is our guest, I thought I'd ask you the first question. I am told this is your passion project, that you saw the documentary Anita, and you executive produced this film. And if you could talk about playing Anita and the process, that would be great.
Sure. This film has been an absolute passion project for me. My mom is here. It's always fun to embarrass my mom, but my mom is here. And
Valerie, thank you for being with us.
And I always say, I've said this to Anita many times, I feel like my mother prepared me for this movie in many ways, but one of which is that she's a retired professor, so I grew up in a very academic household, and when the hearings were going on, it was a very hot topic in my household. And I will never forget it. I was really young at the time, but I felt the tension between my parents because although they shared a lot of ideology around race, they were hitting up against a wall in terms of gender understanding, and that really struck me as an important moment in my understanding of my own relationship to race and gender. So it was always a very pivotal part of my childhood. And then when I saw the documentary, I was really moved, and I felt like there was more there. I wanted to peek behind the curtain and understand more of the process. And I think partly that's because of my day job at Scandal. I feel like I really have been given a window into more of what the process looks like and kind of the spin doctors and the fixers. And so I knew that there were more power players who were stirring the pot and making decisions and pressuring the situation. And I wanted to untangle more of that. So I started reading more and got together with some other really fantastic, prolific producers who were having the same idea, that they felt like there was a movie there. And rather than fight over the material, we got together and decided to create this film, Confirmation.
Anita, do you want to add to that?
I guess one of the things that I like about just what you said was this whole idea of process. Lawyers talk about process all the time, and people say, oh, well, you mean technicalities. And no, we're really talking about how people understand the truth and understand what reality is and how you get to the answer to questions, not the answers themselves, but how you get to the answer. And so often that's not what you see portrayed. You see the answer, and then you see a reaction to the answer. So having people who were really interested in the process itself was, I think, so important, because for me it's in many ways, in terms of the issues that were raised, sexual harassment, racism, sexism, is about how do we get to understanding those issues? What not only are the legal process or the political processes, but what are our thinking processes for understanding those areas?
I think I grew up in a home where feminism was always a positive word, and knowing the name Anita Hill, and looking up to and respecting this legacy. But I also realized we were in a moment where there was a danger that people didn't know this history, and weren't going to know this history, and I felt like this would be an opportunity for me to take someone who has been so pivotal in our understanding of gender. And, we weren't saying the word sexual harassment before this brave woman came forward. And so to also have an opportunity to look at who the woman is behind this legacy, because that for me is what's interesting. It's one of the things that was so interesting about the opportunity to play Anita Hill was to, so often in culture we put people on a pedestal or we tear them down off the pedestal, but we don't consider some of our most iconic, our cultural icons to be human. And that's my job as an actor, is to find the humanity of a character. And so I wanted to access and portray the human being Anita Hill, not just the legacy of Anita Hill, but who the person was and is, and what was at stake for her.
And for those of you who do know me, that wasn't always comfort-making to have somebody who wanted to get to know you. On the one hand, I wanted the portrayal to be accurate, but on the other hand, I am a private person, and most of you will probably say I'm not the easiest person to get to know, and so I think she really had to work hard.
It's another one of the ways that my mom prepared me for this role was because my mother is very sort of private and dignified, and you guys remind me of each other a great deal. But every conversation, I felt like I was in class with a professor who was really monitoring every word. So I was lucky that I grew up in a household where I would hand my papers into my mother before I really handed them in. She would hand them back with red marks. So I felt I wasn't as stressed out maybe as somebody else would have been. But also I really, one of the things we share is the idea of a forced lack of anonymity. I never wanted to be famous, quite honestly. I didn't become an actor because I wanted to be famous. It happens to be one of the occupational hazards of what I do. If you're successful, suddenly people feel that they have access to your private life. And many of you may or may not know that I work pretty hard while staying open to the communities that support me, and I'm very grateful for that. I try to stay open and communicate, but I really do hold my private life private. But that feeling of a loss of anonymity is something that we both really shared, because it was, you make a choice to do something in life or say something or be part of a moment, and it has these repercussions that you're not necessarily prepared for.
Yes, and I'm not sure that anything, I do think that you were prepared to deal with me through your mom. Another reason you were made to do this role. You had the right mom.
It's true. I always have the right mom.
But I don't know that for whether you wanted to be famous or not, I'm sure that nothing really prepares you for what it is.
For cameras outside your house, right? There's nothing that can prepare you for the unwanted questions and the flash bulbs and there's nothing like it.
And the stories that aren't true.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So Carrie, this is a very different role than your work in Shondaland. You portray a real person rather than a fictional one, one who stands or sits next to you. as we speak. You have mentioned earlier in press that this role terrified you.
Yes.
And why?
There is a special pressure to play someone real, particularly if they're still alive. In Last King of Scotland, the woman I played had passed, but I had a similar pressure in Ray. Della B. Robinson was still alive, and you know, you don't want you want the person to feel proud, but you also want to do your own honest interpretation of that character. So it's a tricky balance between telling the story of the film and also respecting the real human. So that was part of what scared me. The other thing I will say is, I remember in our very first conversation, I said, I know that this might be hard for you to once again have to dredge up this period of your life and go back to all this pain. But I was so passionate about the film that I said, almost flippantly, but that's my job. You know, you don't have to do that. I'm going to do that for you. You just help me get there, and then I'm the one who feels the pain for you, not you. And then months later, as I was preparing to play the role, I thought, what was I thinking? This is horrible. This is the worst. And that's what happens often is you're playing somebody at the juncture of in their life that is most challenging and frightening and difficult. And so that week of your life, I had to live in for months. And it was terrifying. But worth it, because it's such an important moment in our history as a people, as a country.
And I would suspect that is really the only way to do honor to any of the roles that you're playing, to actually be willing to live it and to feel it. But that has to be difficult, especially when you're playing multiple characters. And I think there was one moment, though, that I saw you on Scandal, and this was a moment.
It still tickles me that Anita Hill watches Scandal.
Yeah, that was my assignment. I said, well, I'm going to at least know who I'm talking to. But there was that one moment, and I should say, you were in the hospital bed, and I thought, yeah, she could play me.
I was suffering enough in that moment.
Suffering. And I could see it in your eyes, because that was about it.
Anita, some of your questioners were hostile, and most notably Senator Simpson and Danforth. And the two are still judging from press reports annoying. Can you reflect on what, if anything, has changed in Washington culture in the last 25 years?
Oh, boy, gosh. Well, there seem to be a lot of annoyed people in Washington today, and I think if anything, that hearing was perhaps a preview, really, of some of the antagonism that seems to be borne out with just about every day or every week or every major issue that comes along. And so we are, I just think we're seeing it lived out in real time. But it's interesting when you talk about the hearing itself, and Danforth was a harsh critic, Simpson was a harsh critic, Specter was a harsh critic, but it's not as though the Democrats were sort of trying to battle that with their own level of intensity. I think what you have to realize about that moment is that it was a moment when the Senate really could have shown leadership on an issue. Everyone said, we take sexual harassment seriously. Nevertheless, they replicated all of the worst business practices and worst investigatory practices and even worse trial practices and hearing practices. And what I try to think about not so much is what's going on in Washington generally, but 25 years later, or almost 25 years later, I'm asking myself, what if they had actually taken it seriously? What if in that moment they said, we're not going to be so concerned about doing politics as we are concerned about doing leadership. And we're going to inform the public because we know that this is a serious workplace issue. And it's a serious issue on college campuses. And we're going to inform the public about how we should be responding to this. And we're going to do a proper investigation. We're not going to have the FBI do the investigation because the FBI hadn't shown itself to be a body that knew how to investigate sexual harassment. We're not going to play partisan with this issue. We're not going to show this as a trial, which it wasn't. It was a hearing, a fact-finding hearing. What if they had talked about what the appropriate standard for review for sexual harassment is instead of applying some criminal standard of review? How might they have changed the course of our understanding of sexual harassment, and how might they have changed the way businesses do by being that model? And how much anguish could they have spared a lot of women and men in the workplace? So that's really kind of what I look at. What if that had happened? Not just would it have changed the way things are done in Washington, but how might they have changed the way things are done in the world throughout? So Washington is what it is, but at every turn, there is a opportunity to show real leadership about issues that affect people's lives every day. And that's really where I'm hoping this new conversation will take us, because the problem is still there.
Carrie?
What she said.
Okay.
I mean, I'll say it's very striking to me that we're in a similar moment now with our Supreme Court, and I think it's so important that we understand more about process and about, when you hear the responses from Congress about filling this new seat on the Supreme Court, you go, oh, look, again, here is a moment of politics, not of leadership. That's not okay. So for me, part of why it's necessary to tell this story is because we can start to put today's events in a cultural context and understand the ramifications of what happens if we don't participate in our participatory democracy. We are needed in this process, and that's one of the things that's so important for me about the film, is that our voices were needed. Your voices are needed. You have to stand up. You have to come together. When the women of Congress come together and say to the Senate, if you don't do this differently, we will make it very public. You realize, when the phones are ringing in our film, when the phones in all the congressional offices are ringing and women are calling in and saying, do something, you realize we have a voice, and we have to take responsibility for those voices to keep our representatives honest. Their job is to represent us, not to enjoy life on Capitol Hill because we put them there. They work for us, and I think we forget that. And they forget it. So we have to remind them.
I'd like to open up the discussion now to questions from the audience, especially our students. And again, there'll be 2 microphones roaming the aisles. And if you raise your hand, we'll try to get a microphone to you so that we can record your queries. Questions?
He's coming.
Hi, my name's Mary, and I recently graduated from the Heller School, and it's great to see you again, Professor Hill. I took her class, and it was really scary. And I'm so nervous right now. This is so incredible. Something I would love to hear more from both of you, and specifically you, Carrie, is I saw a great interview with you at the Oscars, and you mentioned why you chose to go. And I think so much when we see times of conflict, oftentimes we don't want to talk to the other person that has harmed us, or we want to choose to step back and not participate. And I loved what you talked about why you attended it. And really, if both of you could speak more about working with people that are challenging and that put us in this position.
Well, because you mentioned the Oscars, I will say it's just important for me to remind people that the first thing I said was also that we need all of the voices when these movements for change happen. And so I really do respect and admire the people who chose to not go to the Oscars. You know, I always say the only reason the White House was excited to sit down and talk with Martin Luther King is because Malcolm X was looming in the background, you know? And so you often need lots of voices in order to create change. So I have no judgment about people who didn't go, and I admire that choice. But you also, I think, in moments, and this is something that you've talked about a lot, like it's important to figure out what your relationship to the moment is and to be honest about what feels right for you, and to speak that truth, that you can't do it for the greater good of somebody else's cause. You know, you can't do it for the women's movement. You can't do it for black people. You have to do what feels right in your soul. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, you know, I see the Oscar movement in a way as it's a very interesting moment, not just for motion pictures. It's an interesting moment in terms of how race and gender together are being presented to the world. Yeah. And that makes it important. And so it is important that as many perspectives as you can get are available and engaged. But I also see it as a reflection of a generation of actors coming into their own and saying, look, you know, it's no longer just satisfactory for you to give us, like, you know, representation here. We need to have a voice. Right. We need to be able to feel fully included. And I see that happening on college campuses. I see it happening in Boston Latin. Here in Boston, I see so many examples of how we are now thinking very differently about what it means to be actually diverse. And it's beyond being diverse. You have to be not only included, but you have to be welcomed as included and heard. And so I find it very difficult because, you know, I won't be asked to boycott because nobody would notice, but I think we all have to answer that question: how do I best affect change? Do I affect change best by boycotting? Do I affect change by showing up and talking to the reporters who come by? And I think you're right. Everybody has to answer that question. But it is an important moment, and it was good to see it borne out on the screen and to really have to deal with the different roles that different people were playing, all with the same goal of creating a more inclusive society.
I think you also have to do your homework, you know, because I think there were a lot of people who decided they were going to boycott the Oscars, and I would say, are you aware that the Oscars has a black producer this year? And so by not watching the Oscars, for the first time we have this black producer and a black host. This is an extremely powerful position to be producing the most watched show on television. And he is a prolific producer who produced the movie I was in, Django, who's produced films for 20 years in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. If we don't support him in this moment, how are we impacting the larger story of African-American producing and African-American storytellers in Hollywood if his Oscars fails? So it's another part, like you really have to do the research before you decide where to take the stand, I think, also. And I would say, you know, for me, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to produce this film. Like, I don't think HBO, I love working with HBO. They're the most unbelievably creative and supportive company to work with and for, but nobody was sitting around at home going, you know what we should do? We should do an Anita Hill movie with Kerry Washington. We should do a movie about the Thomas Hill hearings. It would be amazing. Like, that wasn't happening. So for me, this is also an important part for me to say, I don't want to just be in Hollywood and wait at home to be invited to the next party because somebody's producing or directing something and they want me to be there. I want to be part of the person who's having the party and deciding who gets to come. Like that I have to be telling the stories. I don't just want to sit at the table. I want to make the table. I want to create the table, you know?
Other questions? The mic is coming your way. And then here.
Hello, I'm Leanna Hipplett. I'm a Brandeis grad, class of 2010. And I just wanted to ask, when I think often when people think about the women's movement, visually they might think of white women at the front of that movement, and I think often the voice of women of color is not necessarily present. And so I wonder, for the both of you, thinking back at the time of the hearings, do you think things might have been different if it were a white woman that was being put on trial at that time? Or how do you think that your experience differed from what it might have been?
It was your experience in real life.
Did you feel it?
We actually have a line about it in the movie. We have a line about that, like how different would it have been if my character looked like Hill's wife, who is white.
Thomas's wife.
No, sorry. Hill is here. Thomas is, she's not married to a woman.
Yeah. So I have one line about how it might have been different, and that is, think about Strom Thurmond. How might Strom Thurmond have reacted had I not been an African American woman? And I think what I'm my point is, race matters, and it's not trumped by, it's not, doesn't trump. It matters. The total persons you're dealing with, the way that people view sexual harassment is racialized. It's affected by class. It's affected by job status. It's affected by age. It's affected by sexuality. It's affected by so many things. But, and here's the but. There is no way in the world that Senate was willing to deal with sexual harassment. I don't care who had been me. And so I think it might have had an effect on some of the different players, because they couldn't, you couldn't have a strong conservative Southern, former segregationist embracing the person. But at the same time, they weren't prepared to deal with the issue. And it wouldn't have mattered who was bringing the claim.
Oh, we have a question here.
I was going to ask something somewhat related about the intersections between race and sex and how it affected the hearings then, in part because Justice Thomas sort of tried to play in a particular level of like white guilt, and he tried to use that to his advantage. And at the same time, the way that you were treated as if you needed to have some sort of, there needed to be some reason that you were there. Besides just being mistreated by a former employer, there needed some other goal of yours. But beyond that, do you think, considering you were mentioning the importance of the political process, if we did have a more diverse Senate, if you had a different group of people standing in front of you that day, as far as more women, more people of color, could you have seen this issue being a sort of less partisan and a different result that day?
I absolutely think that it would have mattered tremendously if there had been more women of color, more people of color, really more men of color, if Charles Ogletree had been in the Senate to actually respond to the lynching claim. if there had been women of color in the Senate. As it was, there were only 2 women in the Senate out of the body of 100. So,
And none of them were on the committee.
And none were on the committee. Only one chose to try to exercise some effort to making the conversation really much more realistic and about the issues at hand, and showing the significance of the issue in terms of the fitness of the person, of Clarence Thomas, for the role of Supreme Court Justice, to which he was being appointed for a lifetime. So that, I think, is why we talk about diversity, really. We're not just talking about it so we can get bodies in. We're talking about really how the conversation changes. And I think the conversation would have been entirely different. You wouldn't have had, senators were able to sort of fool the public into saying, because you had a lot of them saying, well, we've never experienced this. We have no idea about this sexual harassment thing. What is this all about? I think if they didn't listen to their wives, because there were apparently several wives of senators who had said, yes, this is real. But I think if they had had conversations that involved women in the Senate, and here's an example of why I think that's so, that they would have had a better conversation. We're now dealing with women in the Senate who are talking about issues of sexual assault in the military, sexual
Women's
assault on
reproductive
campuses,
rights.
reproductive rights, equal pay, paid leave, all of which are being introduced into the policy conversation by women. So yes, I absolutely think that is why what would have happened. It would have been a different conversation, and this is why we talk about diversity. It's not just about getting bodies in with different body parts. It's really about getting bodies in with different experiences and who are willing to understand and vocalize those experiences through racial and gender lenses that don't fit some, unrealistic trope that's been presented.
It's also one of the victories of the hearings, is that in the following year, more women ran for office, more women of color ran for office. The appearance of the Senate Judiciary Committee changed. The following year, Biden appointed women to that committee. So it was one of the victories because America sat at home and watched these 2 African Americans talk to a row of old white men. We all saw those optics.
I wonder if you would address the issue of your what-if question, and what if they had taken leadership instead of doing what they did. And when I think about that, I think they could not have taken leadership because they didn't even believe the problem existed.
Mm-hmm.
And if they did believe it existed, they thought it was okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if I think that you have had an incredible impact on changing that scenario in our society. And I wonder if, in terms of legislative bodies, people at universities, and others who often have to hear these sorts of things, where are we on the scale of acceptance of sexual harassment as an absolutely real issue that is harmful to women and exists today?
Well, first of all, we're being pushed. Now, but let me just go back to what if. The one what if they had taken leadership, they would have called experts. If you don't know something, you call
Legitimate
experts.
experts.
They didn't call legitimate experts. They didn't call people who volunteered, who knew something about sexual harassment, had studied sexual harassment, had practiced in the law in the area. So that's what you do when you don't understand, is you call on the experts. How far are we? I just read a survey from Cosmopolitan magazine, 1 in 3 women in the workplace. Now, you're laughing when I say it was a survey from Cosmopolitan. She can't believe I read Scandal. I see Scandal, and you can't believe I read Cosmopolitan. But I did.
But it was a study.
It was a study. Okay, yeah, exactly. Thank you. So, but 1 in 3 women aged 18 to 34 are sexually harassed, reported. in the survey, only 29% actually reported to their employers. That's 71%. 71% of the sexual harassment that's going on is gone unreported. That says a lot about the lack of confidence that we have in our processes. We are dealing with the issues on campuses because we finally had a government that cooperated in the enforcement of the issues on campus, starting in 2011. And that's where we really started to see the movement on college campuses. I saw last year, then that movement kind of picked up with these young women who are out and organizing, and now we have sort of a nationwide organizational structure that is helping move this forward. So we're clearly not there yet. We are still dealing with this problem either on college campuses, and the sexual assault is part of that because of Title IX's coverage. We're still dealing with it in the workplace, and we're just not dealing with it very well. And there are still a lot of people who think that the problem is not a problem. And unfortunately, there are still some women who think that it's just life. It's just the way it is. If you want to practice in the STEM area, if you want to do science, you got to put up with it. If you want to do retail, you got to put up with it. If you want to do food services, you got to put up with it. And no one really is stepping up to really push hard on that. The EEOC recently, by the way, settled a $17 million suit against one employer for the sexual harassment and assault of its employees. So slowly but surely people are getting the message. But I think on the front of how we're doing representation, what is Hollywood's role? I would love, for example, if there was like a real hearing after the Oscars, if Congress would say, you know, this is an issue of national importance.
Of international importance, because our greatest export is entertainment.
Exactly.
So the way we are portraying race and gender, we're taking that out internationally.
And I think you should testify at those hearings.
Okay.
So we're gonna, you know, I don't say that flippantly, because I do see these things are how women are being represented in movies is appalling, especially television. You know, there was a survey recently about sexual harassment happens all the time on television, and it's a laugh line. Even rape happens, and they're jokes. And so these are not unrelated. So how is it that you're supposed to then go into the workplace and understand that somehow this is wrong or illegal when it's been portrayed to you as, you know, something that's just funny or something that you should just shrug off or that doesn't even matter? So we've got a long way to go, and I don't think, I think we can't separate my conversation from your conversation, and I don't even want to try to.
Hi, my name is William Jones. I'd really like to thank you for being here today, both of you. W.E.B. Du Bois has this basically theory that as a black artist, you have to use your work as propaganda. And when I think back to Save the Last Dance, where this line about taking the good black men, or I think to recently last season of Scandal with, I'm a fan, to last season
Thank
Scandal.
you, because a lot of men say, my girlfriend watches Scandal, and so I appreciate you.
Oh no, that's mommy and me time.
Love it, I love it.
But when I watch,
My husband watches too.
so when I watch, you know, that show, and there's scenes where you have to represent a man who recently lost his son, which is just echoes the contemporary actions of like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. I'm asking you, I guess, if you use your work as propaganda, do you consider yourself an activist? And what way does that activism or your choice in performing these actions kind of weigh on you personally also as an artist, and how do you make that cognitive decision of representation? Thank you.
That question made me tired. Thank you so much. I don't think of what I do as propaganda because I'm never trying to manipulate through my work. But I do know that my responsibility as an artist is to find the humanity in the characters I play. And I know that I live in a world where my humanity as a woman is something that people want to ignore, and where my humanity as a person of color is something that people want to ignore. So I'm aware that by choosing the roles and choosing the stories that I choose, the very act of being a fully committed artist is an activist act. It is every time a woman tells a story about a three-dimensional character, every time a person of color tells a story about a three-dimensional character, every time somebody over 40 tells a story about a three-dimensional character. These are the people we want to ignore in culture. So when you force people to pay attention to somebody that the world is trying to disenfranchise, it's an activist act. So I'm grateful that just doing what I love to do has an impact in that way. But I don't choose projects really solely for a message. You know, I didn't choose to do Save the Last Dance because it was a message film. It was a dance movie. But I also knew that I was going to be playing a teen mom, a black teen mom who lived in the inner city in Chicago. And so if I could do that and make people's minds shift from thinking about Chenille as a statistic to thinking about Chenille as a human being, that would be creating change. So I do. Personally, I think I'm just really blessed. I mean, I'm really, really lucky that I get to do what I do and that it has such an impact. In a way, I wish it didn't have so much of an impact. I wish that we lived in a world where we weren't trying to disenfranchise others, where, you know, there was no difference from doing Confirmation to doing Legally Blonde. But there is, you know, and actually Legally Blonde is an incredibly feminist movie. I've been thinking a lot about the intersectionality of things, you know, because I was talking to some girlfriends who were so upset because at last year's Oscars, there was not a single picture nominated for Best Picture that had a woman in the lead. Not one. Every single story had a male lead character, and women were in uproar. It was Oscar so male, you know, for them. And this year, women were so excited because there were 2 films who were up for Best Picture that had female leads. But guess what? Last year, we had 12 Years a Slave. This year, there wasn't a single film about the black experience. So in terms of intersectionality, where do you go when you get slapped both years, you know, where both years you feel like an outsider for some part of who you are? You just have to keep creating work and trying to make room for those stories, for the fullness of those stories.
Oh, hi. Thank you both so much for being here and for your generosity. I have a question about, oftentimes when the hearings are evoked, it is as if feminism is both the work of women and also something that only affects women. And I'm wondering if you both would be willing to talk about how you see the hearings raising urgent questions about masculinity, about dangerous masculinities, and the kind of work we still need to do with thinking about feminism as actually everybody's business, rather than the business of female-identified folk.
I just talked a lot. It's your turn.
Okay. Well, let me just say this. I think the subject matter of the hearing really sort of set it up for questions about masculinity and what it meant really in Washington, D.C. In particular. I mean, that's what we learned. We really learned that, you know, being sexually abusive was almost a prerogative of the Senate. It's like, you know, this is a perk. And being sexist and having the option really of denigrating women or of using them sexually was what it meant to be a male in Washington. We didn't really challenge, I don't think we interrogated it enough. But I think that there was so much of that that was in the background of it, which was why you got so much of this "so what," this is what men in Washington do, and that's how we define masculinity in Washington. And what I say is that it's harmful on so many levels because, one, it's harmful in terms of how can you turn around and represent women if, in fact, you think that this is the norm. But then I see these questions coming up in different settings, and now I will not remember the individual's name, the young player who was in the Miami Dolphins, who left the team because, Jonathan Martin, because he was being harassed by his teammates. Harassed and bullied, and it was sexual, and it was physical, and here we have this big football player, and he quit. He left the team. And the first reaction was, oh, he should just man up. As though this is what you're supposed to be able to do and put up with, and that's just a part of being a man. And I thought people say, well, he just quit, he just left it. I think it took more courage to leave and to say, this is not a valid view of what masculinity is. We are perpetuating something through sports and this behavior that is hurting all of us, women and men. And I think it ultimately has led to a lot of young men being liberated, but also a lot of women contributed to his ability. Feminism contributed to his ability to leave that space and say that I will not tolerate that. But I think it was liberating, not only, it was affirming for us, but I think it was liberating for men. And so that's a long way of saying I think feminism has, in fact, been shown instances where feminism has actually directly impacted the lives of men and sort of relieve them of this burden of hypermasculinity that is unrealistic and unplausible and in many, many ways harmful to men and women.
Thank you. We have one last question.
Hello. Hi. My name is Taneri. Thank you very much. My question is, I guess, about how mobilization of justice work and visibility work in a time where we seem to be inundated with certain images. I think that there's really effective work you mentioned. For example, the girls at Columbia who are doing the work of carrying around the mattress and the kind of visibility that brought to rape and sexual assault on college campuses. I think a lot about the racial justice movements that have been on campuses around the country, including this one recently. But I guess part of the hope, I think, of some of those missions is that through visibility we have certain conversations, but I think that there are also a lot of complications in terms of how we get that visibility to be something that mobilizes people versus something that they feel overly inundated by. And I was wondering if through either your actions, Professor Hill, or your work, Carrie, there were ways in which you've been able to come up with ways to overcome those sorts of tensions or work through them?
It's so funny because I think it's one of the things that comes up when you look at the hearings is, and you're seeing it a lot now in our current political stage, that the idea that if you ask someone to consider a position other than their own, that you're somehow robbing them of their safety, that you're somehow robbing them of their power. It's one of the reasons why I love what I do, because I think we can be a bit subversive in that I'm not actually asking you to sit down and talk policy in my day job. I do that in my off time, but in my in my daytime, I'm not asking you to consider policy, I'm asking you to consider humanity. Because I think often the conversation about policy is easier to have when people can sit in a more compassionate space. I think it's when we hold up those walls between us that separate us, when we say that person is other, I am this and they are that, and I don't want to share because I'm afraid that if I allow that person at the table, there won't be enough for me to eat. I think when we sort of through art say our hunger is the same, then we're more apt to allow that experience of sitting at the table together, not to kill the table metaphor. But I think that's why I love the experience of how art changes people, is because it really is about first opening up your heart to what connects us as human beings. You sort of, while I'm playing someone other in most of my work to a lot of people, you realize how we're all the same, that we all have fear, we all have love, we all have hunger, we all have pain, we all have joy. And so although I am so specific in my work as a woman and as a person of color, we realize that the universal is in the specific. And that, I think, is a much stronger place to have these conversations from, because it's more open. Because it's hard. It is hard. People feel very antagonized.
Yeah. And I will just say, art allows people to have different conversations that they might not have had. Social movements, protests, really spark conversations. Policy changes, litigation.
Yep.
All of these spark conversations, but really at the core of each one of those has to be humanity. And I think what we are experiencing now is a wonderful time, really, where all of those things are coming together. If we think about the same-sex marriage cases that have been really engaging us in a different kind of way of talking about what the harms of homophobia are, on a personal level as well as a legal level. It undervalues us as a country. It undermines us as a country in terms of who we are. If we talk about really what is going on college campuses and really think about it, we understand that, if we don't have these colleges, these conversations in an academic institution, how are we ever going to have them in the workplace or in sort of the real world, as they say, if we can't have really open and honest conversations here? And this is really wonderful laboratory because we can get to the humanity of people here in ways because we live in these campuses. It's not as though we just come and go. For many of you, this is a place where you live. And so we know each other in ways here. So this is a special opportunity. The art that we are seeing portrayed, and that's why this movement in Hollywood is so important, because it can shape our conversations in different ways. All of these have to happen, though. None of them can do it alone. So whatever, I would just say whatever and wherever you are, whether you're still on the college campus or not, whether you're interested in doing litigation, whether you're a lawyer or not, whether you're an artist or not, everybody has a role in addressing important social issues of the day. For me, mine was harassment and now sexual assault and gender equality as well as racial equality. The movements are about inclusion. The art is about so much. It's about representation. Everybody has a critical role, and we can all play it. And it's, people say, well, don't you get discouraged? And I say, well, not as discouraged as I would be if we don't do it. And so I just encourage you to take wherever you are and whatever you're doing and realize that you have an important role to play in moving these issues far beyond, really, where we are today, and maybe even far beyond what we have imagined.
Carrie?
I'm so jealous that you guys get to have her every day. It's so unfair. Not every day, but often.
Almost every day. Almost every day.
Carrie, thank you so much for flying all the way here. And now I think it's time for you to
fly
back.
fly back.
Yeah. Can I just say, people have asked me about Kerry Washington. And No, it's all good. It really is all good. You know, I have just been so fortunate because not only is she a wonderful actress, but I do believe that she is just the perfect person, actually, to play this role. I would say she portrays me as much more dignified and calm and intelligent than I certainly felt in 1991. But that wouldn't take much. But all kidding aside, I feel honored that you're here today, and I'm just so honored that you chose to not only portray but to produce this movie.
I love you. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you so much.
Your team is here.